4. Freedom from emotional pain. Fears, phobias, anxieties, and other emotional states can be as debilitating as physical illnesses. Just like physical symptoms, psychological distress can have its origin in past life events. Once those are discovered, healing can be rapid and relatively complete. Freedom and joy can be regained. Not all our afflictions are rooted in the traumas of prior lifetimes. Current life events are sometimes the culprits, or may even be compounding past life seeds. And the stresses of today's competitive and overly materialistic world add their own weight to our emotional maladies. So much sadness and anxiety assail us because we are easily distracted and overwhelmed by day-to-day events. We have to juggle work, relationships, and interactions with other people at every moment. We have to deal with our daily needs. And so we forget that we are spiritual beings, which leads to emotional turmoil. Spiritual beings should think and behave like spiritual beings. That is our nature and ultimate destiny. But when the circumstances of everyday life lead us astray and we forget our true nature, that is when sorrow, worry, and fear enter. That is when inner peace, joy, and happiness exit. All we have to do is remember. Remember who we are and what we have been through, where we have come from, why we are here. As we do this, emotional healing will naturally follow, just as it did for the authors of the stories in this chapter. As emotional symptoms are resolved, the patient's family and friends benefit as well. Their stress and responsibility are lessened. Even beyond this healing shift, relatives and significant others may indirectly experience the feelings and facts of the regression. As they hear the patient's stories, they feel the emotion and the immediacy of the memories. They react and respond to the improvement in their loved ones' lives. Often, to their surprise and joy, they find their own symptoms and illnesses disappearing. Such was the case with Myra's lover in the remarkable story that follows. The Lesson of Love. The story of how I became acquainted with the powerful process of experiencing one's past lives began during my summer vacation after 7th grade. I had grown up in communist Bulgaria, and topics of any mystical or religious nature were simply not a part of my upbringing. However, a few years before that summer, the wave of the democratic revolution had swept through Eastern Europe, and spiritual information had become readily available. That summer, I was 13 years old. I came across your book, Through Time into Healing. Even though the concept of reincarnation was not a part of my childhood, and I doubt it was ever discussed in my presence, I did not question the possibility of its existence. It just seemed so natural, so normal. As Voltaire said, "It is not more surprising to be born twice than once." I absolutely loved the stories in the book. I loved the wisdom in it, the possibilities it presented to me. I loved it so much that upon reading the final pages, I immediately decided to make a recording of myself reading the sample script given in the book and experience a regression for myself. As I was getting ready to begin recording, I remember thinking, but I am only 13. There is really nothing wrong with me. I have no phobias, no physical ailments. Why would I do this? But the pull, the curiosity in me was too strong to resist. I made the recording, rewound the tape to the beginning, and even though I did not know what to expect, I pressed play. The recording guided me through a beautiful relaxation, and I felt very calm and comfortable. But at the moment I crossed through the door into a past life, that changed. I immediately dropped into the body of a woman who was running for her life, and I became her. My heart was pounding with fear, and my inhalations of air were short, abrupt, and desperate. It was terrifying. I was running down a dimly lit hallway, and knew that there were men chasing after me who would kill me if they caught me. My gray suit consisted of a jacket and a skirt made of thick wool. I wore black stockings and black shoes with small heels. My dark hair was neatly tucked in a bun on the back. The brick walls reverberated with the sound of my steps as I ran. There were rows of doors on both sides, but upon trying to open them, I discovered that they were all locked. Finally, a door handle gave in. I entered the room and saw that it was bare, with one small window with bars on it that was high up on the wall, close to the ceiling. I knew that I was trapped and that they would catch me. It was at the time of World War II. I was a doctor who, instead of healing a German general, had poisoned and killed him. That is why these men were after me. They were seeking revenge. The next scene was one that I looked at from above. I saw how I was put on an electric chair, how my hands and legs were strapped to it, how I was executed. Then something truly beautiful happened. I watched as my spirit rose from my body. It slowly drifted upward. There was a trail of white light in front of it that it followed. At the end of that path there was an open door through which a magnificent white light was shining. At the door there stood a being that glowed with love and light, waiting to greet my spirit. I felt such peace, such love, and such a sense of being eternal. That night I eagerly waited for my mother to return from work. I told her what I had experienced and asked her if electric chairs had really existed during World War II. Years later, I learned that they had been around since 1890. That event was a formative experience in my life, and it is interesting that it happened at the age of 13. The number 13 is believed to be the number of change. To numerologists and tarot readers, it is a number of transformation. It calls for a study of one's basic principles, what one believes in. It attracts changes in the way a person defines everything in her life, which leads to shifts in her worldview and her existence. I had certainly been transformed by my first regression. Many years later, the story of the lifetime that I had experienced as a child developed even further at a workshop at Omega Institute led by Brian. During one of the group regressions, an image of a long road lined with birch trees began emerging in my mind. I saw myself a young woman walking down a quiet dirt road in the country. In my hand I carried a small suitcase, and on my head I had a kerchief. I was leaving my village to move to St. Petersburg to study medicine. The final stop I made on my way was to go to the cemetery, where I paid my respects at the graves of my dead relatives. My heart was heavy. It would be many years before I could return back home, if at all. While studying at the university, I was recruited by the Secret Service of the Soviet Union. There were troubles brewing in Europe, and there were even talks of a possible war. They sent me to Europe to spy for my country. I was a very attractive woman who knew how to use her charm, and it was easy for me to gather information. I saw a vivid scene of me sitting in front of a small device that I was using to send coded wires with the information I collected. There was a nightclub establishment frequented by many Americans. I found myself going there as often as I could, hoping to meet a particular man I had come to know. I was surprised to discover within me that I was interested in him not because of my work, but because I was falling in love with him. He was in love with me, too. The next scene unfolded on a large set of stairs in front of a big administration building. I had received orders to move to a different location in Europe, so I had come to say goodbye. The man stood in front of me, telling me that he loved me, begging me not to leave, and asking me to marry him. Even though I loved him very much, I could not stay. I had already given my word and pledged my life, my love, and my heart to my country. I assured him that when he went back home to the family farm in America, he would marry a nice woman, have children, and be happy. I said goodbye, and, with tears in my eyes, rushed down the stairs toward the car that was waiting for me. Later, I married an important German officer. It greatly facilitated my work and protected me. World War II had already begun. I had been practicing medicine, mostly treating German military men, and had received orders to terminate a high-ranking German general whom I was treating for an illness. I saw myself standing in front of a table. Next to me, sitting on a chair, was the general. There was a glass of water on the table. I held a small container with powder in it and looked up toward the ceiling, feeling anxiety within me for what I was about to do. Yet, thinking that there was no other choice, I poured the powder in the glass. Instead of giving the general his medication, I had given him poison. This is where my first regression as a child fits in. I saw myself again running down that hallway and eventually getting caught. But this time, because I was much older and better able to handle the whole story, I saw the gruesome details of the interrogations to which I was subjected. Did I betray my network? No. Until the very end, I maintained that I had acted alone. I was beaten, tortured, questioned, and then many more times all over again beaten, tortured, and questioned. The only thing that my interrogators spared me from was rape. They felt that I had belonged to one of them, and that was a line they could not cross. At the end, they placed me on an electric chair and executed me. As my spirit was rising above the scene, I knew that the lesson of that lifetime was a lesson of love, of needing to approach every situation with love, and of allowing myself to be loved too. That whole lifetime had been orchestrated so that I could have the opportunity to choose love when standing on those stairs, as the American man asked me to marry him. Yet I chose to stay true to my promise to serve my country. I also knew that after I left, he felt that he had nothing to live for. My leaving had broken his spirit. He died in a dirt ditch, having been shot right in the forehead during combat with the German army. In the hours that followed this experience, I was shaken to my core and filled with an enormous sense of regret for having wasted one whole lifetime and for having harmed another person. But knowing that we are eternal, I also know that every lifetime enriches our souls with invaluable lessons. My soul must have chosen to experience and learn the lesson of profound love in my current lifetime, because nothing gives me a greater sense of meaning and fulfillment than bringing love, light, and inspiration to people. One of the ways I most enjoy assisting people is by helping them to experience their past lives and gain understanding about the people and the circumstances that surround them. I am also in a very loving relationship with a man who, coincidentally, has two very deep-seated and irrational fears. The first, a fear of ever losing me, and the second, of being shot point-blank in the forehead. It makes me wonder, is this my second chance at love with the American man I once knew? Myra Kelly. As a 13-year-old, Myra acted upon her intuitive wisdom and her curiosity for understanding and spiritual growth as she listened to the tapes that she had made. This decision changed her life, leading her to her higher potentiality, her healing work, and eventually to a reunion with her soulmate. Her soulmate's fear of losing her again is typical of the underlying theme of separation anxiety. Frequently, children who seem almost irrationally frightened of being separated from their parents have actually lost them in previous lives. They subconsciously remember the loss, just like Myra's present-day lover. The cure for this type of separation fear is to recognize its root in a past life event. The trauma has already happened. It is from another time, and it is not something to fear in the present or in the future. Her soulmate's concerns about once again losing Myra and of being shot in the head both stem from the World War II era. Knowing this, he can release them and nurture a relationship that is freer and not constricted by deep-seated insecurities. Myra's description of the events after her physical death, when her spirit left her body, closely echoes studies of the near-death experience, NDE studies, that she was not aware of when she was only 13. The magnificent restorative light and the loving spiritual being in Myra's story are universally encountered in the NDE. Their comforting presence and validation of the afterlife help people lose their fear of death and dying. We are, they remind us, immortal, and death is but a doorway to the other side. Every so often, a synchronicity will arise and almost forcibly seize my attention. Synchronous events are apparently coincidental occurrences of related events that, to me, have a linkage at a metaphysical level. We may not understand that causal linkage, but it is there. As I finished writing my reflections on Myra's story early in 2012, my phone buzzed with an incoming email. Less than 5 minutes had elapsed since I wrote about releasing present-day fears because the traumas had already happened in a past life. In the email, a woman described to me how her crippling fear of flying had prevented her from fully enjoying life. Traveling for pleasure and for business was severely restricted. In 2003, she had attended a workshop that I was conducting in Miami. As I led the group through a past life regression, she began to vividly remember a World War II lifetime. I found myself looking out of an airplane cockpit. I was a man, the pilot of a military personnel transport plane, she wrote. The plane crashed due to mechanical failure, killing all passengers and crew, as well as my co-pilot and myself. The workshop ended. Within a short period of time, the fruits of her regression were ready to harvest. 11 days after the workshop, she explained, I had an emergency call and needed to fly to Boston. I felt nothing, zero, no fear. There was nothing. Since that day in 2003, I have flown many times and have never had a single moment of fear or anxiety. So, though this has been a long time coming, thank you, Dr. Weiss. If I needed a cosmic exclamation point, here it was. Only moments after I had written about it, confirmation that current fears and phobias often have past life roots arrived by email. Remembering these roots can completely cure the symptoms. There is no need to be anxious or afraid anymore. The workshop that cured this woman took place nearly 9 years ago, yet her email came within just 5 minutes of a perfect bullseye. She could have told me her story at any time over all those years. The probability of the timing being a coincidence is remote. And, as a final connection, both stories involved traumatic deaths in World War II. Myra shares another story with us. Learning to Allow. This is the story of Ananachimo and the lesson of needing to allow. In one of the regression exercises that I did with Brian Weiss during a workshop at the Omega Institute, the image of a group of people crawling up a small slope emerged. I wondered what this image could have been, and if it was something I needed to brush to the side in my mind in order to get to something more valid. However, I remembered Brian saying that this might be the thread that pulled me in, and I decided to stay with it and see what developed. The picture came into focus. The group of people was a band of Native Americans. I wondered which tribe they belonged to, and in my head popped the answer that they were with the Plains Indians. Next, I began searching for myself among the group of people. And there I was. In an instant I knew that my name was Ananachimo. I kept on repeating the name to myself in order to remember it, as it was a name I had never heard before. At the moment that I identified myself as Ananachimo, I fully became him. Everything that I experienced in that lifetime was as if I were fully that person, feeling his emotions, feeling what it was like to have his body. Ananachimo was a young man with an agile, lean, and muscular body. He was tall, with long black hair and a strong, square jaw. Around his neck he wore the tooth of a white bear that he had killed in a hunting trip up north. The band of Indians was very careful when ascending the slope. On the top of the slope was a flat area where a house was built. They were spying on the settlers who lived there, and who had been invading the lands of Ananachimo's tribe. Ananachimo was looking across a valley that was surrounded by hills as far as the eye could see. He lifted his left hand, placed his palm in front of his shoulder, and gave a solemn vow to protect his land and his people from the settlers. He was greatly attuned to nature. Nature spoke to him. He heard the whisper of the trees when their leaves were swaying in the wind. Every flower, bush, and blade of grass carried a message that he was able to read. He was also a healer, using herbs to bring the health of his people back into balance. An important event occurred in Ananachemo's life when he was 37 years old. He had captured and bonded with a Mustang that had big red and white spots. The name of the horse was Red Lightning. The white people had somehow taken possession of his Mustang. Ananachemo tried to free it, but they caught him and accused him of stealing the horse. To punish him, the white people tied his hands above his head and whipped him. I did not experience the horror of every whip falling on his back. I only saw that as the white people began whipping him, the horse, which was nearby, watched everything and shared Ananachemo's anger and sense of injustice. It was raising its front legs, kicking, and making terrible noise as it tried to free itself. However, it was futile. This event broke Ananachemo's spirit. He lost his horse. He also lost faith in his ability to protect his land and his people. He felt that great injustice was being done, but that he was powerless to bring about any change. As time went by, things got worse. His tribe was driven toward the northwest. They were far away from their hunting grounds. On a cold day, at the age of 42, Ananachemo died. He was lying down in his tepee, feeling defeated because he could not protect his people. He could not save them when his spirit left his body. Outside, women and children from his tribe, as most men had died, were going about their day. They were cold, hungry, and completely lost. As the regression was nearing its end, I began searching for the soul lesson of that life. The lesson was all about allowing. I had to learn to allow. I blamed myself for having failed to protect and save my people, but the truth was that I could not have saved anyone or protected them from the painful historic events. I must allow for people's lives to unfold as they were meant to, because their souls need these experiences. They have agreed to go through challenges to learn their own lessons and find their own enlightenment. I had seen the big injustice caused by the white men as an evil that I had promised to fight, yet I had failed to really be of help in times when I was most needed. People do not need saving. People need love, support, and encouragement that they can withstand any trials and will always come out stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. I cannot shelter anyone from the storms of life, or they will never grow, learn, and expand. But how do you allow? How do you maintain the balance of being loving, kind, and helpful against wanting to save people from the injustice of the world or their own silly mistakes? This lesson continued to be a challenge for me so many years and lifetimes later. Even though I changed my gender, my name, and my appearance, I still want to rush in and shield people. I left the class session and headed to my room that night with these heavy questions on my mind. My cabin at Omega had 2 rooms in it. Upon entering the hallway, I met one of my neighbors. She was on her way to the bathroom, which was shared between our rooms. A moment later, she realized that she and the other roommate, who was showering, had locked themselves out, as both their keys were in their room and the door automatically locked. It was raining heavily outside, and my neighbor was barefoot. What a situation to find yourself in. I offered to help. As I walked in the rain trying to find an Omega staff person, I instantly recognized that this little crisis unfolded because of me. What a beautiful gift that was. It delivered to me the final piece of my lesson. I should always help people in every way I can, and should spare no effort when assisting them on their path. Yet I should never try to alter the course of their lives by shielding them or trying to save them from their troubles, because doing so would impede their invaluable experiences and the expansion of their souls. I was so grateful to our lovely neighbors. My lesson had crystallized for me. It has been almost 3 years now since that regression, and that understanding created an incredible transformation in me. Now I have a different perspective on needing to rush in and save people. I have learned to allow, to admire, and to see the immense value and power in the unfolding of everyone's path. Myra Kelly. Myra again presents a classic regression experience and important divine truths. When you are open to these lessons and you trust the wisdom that guides you on your path, you will observe the synchronicities, the manifestation of grace, the helping hand. These events are not random. They are not coincidences. As she struggled to comprehend her regression's message of allowing without interfering, Myra was led within hours to the scene that would provide her with the insight to understand, a scene as simple as two people being locked out of their room. I know the rooms at Omega well. There are no phones inside them, so Myra could not call for assistance. The paths are unlit, and to walk such a great distance in the pouring rain takes considerable effort. This was no small gesture of help on Myra's part. With a flash of recognition, she learned the nuances of her spiritual lesson. Great teachers have always used such examples, scenarios, parables, and metaphors to help us understand their teachings. As did Myra, Raymond had a flash of recognition as he learned his own spiritual lesson, although to him it felt more like an electric shock. In one day, his entire world was turned upside down and inside out. You have already read his fascinating account of shared consciousness with a stranger, but now let us regress back in time to his first ever past life experience. Finding Hope. Hope. If there is one predominant outcome of your trainings and experiences, it is that one is left with a hope that may not have existed before. For whatever reason, belief systems tend to be subjective and may be shaken by global or personal events, yet your trainings offer a distinct opportunity to add actual experience to faith or belief, yielding an outcome that may be rationalized but not denied. For me, that resulting and abiding outcome equals hope. First, a little background. I am a licensed professional therapist in the state of Oklahoma, and I have spent 25 years working with chronic schizophrenia patients in an inpatient setting. I designed the behavioral system and had oversight of the program. Thus, as a behaviorist and therapist, you might say that structure was my guiding principle. What follows next is the universe's none-too-subtle method of saying, Mr. Wilson, your structure is microscopically small, and the comfort and security that you have experienced within that structure is not where it begins or ends. Approximately 5 years ago, I found myself in desperate need of quite a few continuing education hours to renew my license as a professional therapist. Like many others, I typically wait until the last minute and begin seeking them in a panic. I do not recall how I found out about the seminar. However, I saw it as an opportunity to get the hours that I needed and didn't think much about the content. My wife and I arrived at the Crossings in Austin, and the next morning I joined many others in the first session. I was, needless to say, quickly convinced that I was in the room with a bunch of nuts when people began to identify themselves as angel therapists, Reiki masters, and so forth, terms of which I had never heard. I had the distinct feeling that I was in the wrong place. Raised in a quite strict conservative Southern Baptist environment, and subsequently having strayed from organized religion, I had not filled that slot with anything else. The result of this religion void was that I considered myself moral, black and white, and strongly attached to God on a personal rather than an organizational level. In other words, I had God well defined and in a box that I created for him, and I was happy as long as he stayed within my parameters. The first hour of the seminar had me ready to run out the door and not look back. However, at the break I told my wife of my misgivings, and she said, "Look, you need the hours. You are already here, you have paid for the week, and you might as well stick it out." Reluctantly, I agreed. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Weiss did a group regression. I cannot emphasize enough that I closed my eyes with trepidation and extreme disbelief and caution. I would have bet the farm that my resistance would have prevented any hypnotic state. If I were ever wrong in my life about anything, this was the hands-down winner of that category. I immediately found myself in a seashore village as a 10-year-old boy. The homes had thatched roofs with a dirt and rock path winding between them. There were geese and dogs here and there running loose. The grass was green as green can be, and I was running and playing along the path. There were others in the village. I knew them, but paid them no mind. I rounded the corner of one of the houses, and from up the hill behind me, I heard a strong male voice call what I knew to be my name, Johar, or Johar. I stopped, he called again, and I went running to what I knew was my father. He was at our home near the top of the path, working on a large grinding stone that appeared to be a wheel. He was sharpening axes and swords, and I knew this was his job. It was clear that this was a Norse village. In the next scene I was 18 years old, and my father and I, along with many other Norsemen, were in a ship sailing to a foreign shore for the purpose of attack and plunder. I stood in front of my father and said, without looking back at him, "I don't know what to do." He responded, "You will know when you get there." In my present life, I had seen pictures before of Norsemen and what they wore. However, it was while on this ship that I had the realization of what each piece of clothing was for. For the first time I recognized that the arm bracelet was actually for defense against weaponry. Then we were back in our own village, and my father was lying on a stiff-looking bed. He was dying from a wound that he had received while we were in battle, as I kneeled by his side. Later I had returned from another battle, and I lay dying, just as my father had. My own young son was kneeling by my side, just as I had knelt by my father. There, in response to, "What have you learned?" I remember thinking, we have not learned anything. Here we are, generation after generation, still fighting and dying, and my son will do the same. At this point we were brought out of the hypnotic state. I was, for lack of a better phrase, freaked out. In the course of probably 15 minutes, my world was turned upside down and inside out. Doubt and trepidation turned to a feeling of bewilderment in that I had no category or place to put this, nor any means of denying it, digesting it, or hiding it, any of which I would have gladly done. While Dr. Weiss did not press for whether or not the experiences were real, there was no question in my mind that they were, and that my current life and future had been altered. All of a sudden, I was far more concerned about my own mental health than that of the angel therapy folks or anyone else. Oddly enough, while this shook me to the core, it did not shake my belief in God. Rather, it began an ongoing process of taking God out of myself and my childhood-created box and recognizing what eternity really meant. I left at the lunch break, and my wife could tell that something was wrong with me. In a period of 3 hours, I went from a black-and-white thinker to basically a man without certainty of anything. My belief system and limitations thereof had been shattered. There was no question that what I experienced had been true. My hypnotic state was technicolor and as real as my hands are to me now. My prior knowledge of Norse life did not hold a candle to what I knew in the experience. My name was Johar, and I knew that it was my name. After returning home from the training, I looked for it on the internet and found it on a site of ancient Norse names, as I knew it would be. The following day found me between two worlds, and I went into the seminar thinking, what next? Almost as if I were someone sentenced to be thoroughly kicked and resigned to it. Sure enough, the next regression was more bizarre than the first. I went on to have a cosmic experience in which I became part of human evolution, a dream that allowed me to connect to the entire universe, and a shared experience with a complete stranger in which I could see the details of his regression. I have worked for 25 years with medically fragile children and chronic schizophrenics, and your seminar allowed me some sense of peace as to the outcomes that many of these unfortunate folks experience. Little else has made sense. I came to your training seeking continuing education credits, and I left with proof of universal consciousness. Most of all, I came away with a hope that previously was sadly lacking. It is my belief that if others could experience that hope, their world and personal view would improve, as did mine. Raymond Wilson. I am grateful to whatever universal forces conspired to land Raymond in our 5-day course. He is such a gift, a big-hearted, down-to-earth man who is doing truly difficult and delicate professional work. He came for the continuing education credits and left having earned Transform Your Life credits. He also transformed our entire group. Even though Raymond's past life regression was joyless and taught the futility of violence and war, he nevertheless came away with a sense of hope. With each subsequent experience during the week, his hope increased. Finally, he had encountered the answer to the purpose of his life and the awareness that an expanded vision of God and eternity actually existed. Life is not just a meaningless and continuous struggle to survive. As he will continue to describe in stories throughout this book, in only 1 week, Raymond felt connected to the stream of existence, from the very beginnings of life on Earth, through Viking and other incarnations, into the entire cosmos and all of eternity. He saw and felt himself a part of the universal evolution and the indescribable wisdom that guides the whole process. He no longer felt separated or alienated. Many people come to my workshops with an enthusiastic wish to remember a past life. They have read the books, they recognize the healing power of regressions, and they know that miracles happen. During these workshops, I often make the point that the people who have been dragged there by their significant others or well-meaning friends, who have no expectations or even interest in having a past life regression, are often the very people who have the most vivid and compelling ones. Raymond, who certainly had his doubts about the nature of this work, is a perfect example. He came only for the professional credits. In fact, were it not for the gentle convincing of his wife, he would have left the seminar entirely. Yet he had numerous powerful and deeply spiritual experiences. Why does this occur? Our own expectations and desire to relive a past life can often get in our way. We may want it so much that we try to force the process, and, paradoxically, we block it. However, with practice we can overcome any such obstacles. It is important to practice without any frustration and without any attachment to the outcome of a particular session. Don't say, "I have to have a regression," for that will only prevent it from happening. There is no need to put this kind of pressure on yourself. Just accept whatever comes to your mind, whether you are meditating, listening to a hypnosis CD, participating in a group regression, or working one-on-one with a therapist. There is a process and wisdom at work. As you have already read, what you call this process, whether the Tao or the Way or Destiny or any other name, does not matter. What does matter is that you trust it to guide you to wherever it is that you need to go. Take your time and be patient. You may not immediately remember a past life, but instead have a mediumistic experience, perhaps getting a message from the other side. You may have a physical healing, a remission of a troubling symptom. Every time that you practice, you are learning how to relax and how to let go of stress. You're helping your immune system and becoming healthier. These are extremely therapeutic benefits for your mind and body, and they are valuable in their own right. The more that you practice without becoming frustrated, the deeper and deeper you will go. It may take weeks or months, but the gains are worth it. It took me 3 months until I could remember a past life. One of my patients tried for 8 years before ever successfully regressing, but once she did, the results were incredibly profound. She has since told me that every minute that led up to those ancient memories was worth it. If your past life recall brings you healing or spiritual growth or a sense of oneness and peace, then wouldn't 8 years, or even 8 lifetimes, be time well spent? I have had many patients or workshop participants who, like the authors in this section, were able to achieve emotional healing simply by remembering their past lives. Their stories have stayed with me long after their regressions ended, and I have interspersed some of them throughout this chapter. One such person was Yumiko, in this life a Japanese-American physician who remembered a past life as an impoverished young girl in London, England, several centuries ago. In the past lifetime, she had been the oldest child of 6, and by the age of 10 she was working very hard within the family. With no father present in her life and a mother who was often away at work, Yumiko had to raise her siblings, and as just a little girl she was taking care of many other young children and babies. She could recall her one dress and how it smelled because she couldn't wash it. She could see the people urinating in the street, and especially, she remembered not having any soap. She had to wash with only water, but without soap, clothes could never be truly clean once worn. She was forced to become a servant in a bigger, much grander house. This family had soap. Eventually, because she was treated so poorly by the madam, she ran away. Not long afterward, she died at a young age of hunger, starvation, and illness, and she floated above and left the past life memories. Yumiko's next memory was of her childhood in her present life, in which she was the oldest of 3 children. She recalled an incident in which her brother's nappy, or diaper, had fallen off, which she then had to wash. But this time she had soap. Her thought was, this was a piece of cake. Indeed, she was smiling as she relived this moment and thought of all the things that she was able to do as a child, reading, drawing, that she could never do as a child in her past life due to her extreme poverty. While still in the hypnotic state, she explained to the group that she had learned to be happy about the small things, like a bar of soap. As she told us all, be grateful for and appreciate what you have, not what you don't have. Yumiko's story teaches us that we should not take anything for granted, and that we should recognize the blessings that we do have, no matter how small they may be. If we need little but appreciate everything, we will be much happier. As Lao Tzu said over 2,000 years ago, he who knows he has enough is rich. After remembering 2 prior lifetimes in which she died alone, Tong could now, in her present life, fully appreciate the blessing of being surrounded by loving friends and family. Her story follows. Lifetimes of Loneliness. During my stay at your 5-day training course, I had several regressions. In 2 of them I died in a very lonely state. In the first life I was a teacher who taught in a hillside primary school in a primitive and poor village. I was a single woman who lived alone. It seemed that I was not intimate with my students. I died accidentally on the hill, where wild dogs bit at my stomach. Nobody was aware of my death. In the second regression, I was a reporter, and again a single woman. I worked hard and quite aggressively, but I again died lonely, this time in a train crash. When others who were either dead or injured were picked up by their families, I was still lying on the side. Nobody came to pick me up. Nobody claimed my corpse. In both of the cases, I was cool and reserved as a person. That's why I was rather lonely during the lives, and in the moments of death as well. But in this life, I chose to be a social worker. I go to people and offer help. I adopted 2 girls, not just to develop my own family, but also to help, in a very intensive way, these 2 little girls. I have learned to give and relate to others, even if sometimes I've struggled to do so. And I am so happy with all of these people nearby. I know that in this life I will never die alone again, with nobody around me. Tong. Tong's regressions demonstrate that patterns often reveal themselves in these experiences to illuminate our spiritual paths. She needed to express and to receive love, and she is doing exactly that. Tong is learning her lessons and finding out more about unconditional love. We are never alone, even if we forget this. And her choice of a social work career preceded the regression. She had intuitively chosen the path of love and service. These were not Tong's only experiences. Here she shares more. Homeward Bound. My mother and father separated when I was 6 years old, and divorced a few years later. They often had fights in the middle of the night. One day I woke up in the morning and found that my mom had left, and her bed became vacant from then on. She had her new family soon after, and then so did my dad. I had grown up in a childhood with lots of loneliness and anxiety, lots of neglect. I have 3 sisters, but we were often left at home without an adult to look after us. As the second sister, I had to take care of the small ones by providing them with food or cooking them meals, later when I could manage the task, and by doing the household chores when my elder sister was not at home. When I was in primary school, my mom would forget to take me home. I would stand at the school gate for hours, waiting for her with loads of loneliness, helplessness, and uncertainty. At 25, I got married, which I had longed to do. My husband is a colleague of mine in the same office, so we can see each other during business hours. He is a family-oriented man who gave me a sense of security after we married. However, I still found myself lonely whenever he was not with me, as when he worked late, went out for an evening class, or had drinks with his buddies. And I worried that he was not mature enough to manage his tasks or any challenges in life. This fear haunted me in a subtle way for a long time. I also began, rather desperately, to long for babies of my own. I thought that then I would be wanted by somebody, and that I would always be with the kids if I could just have them. However, I tried for more than 6 years. I couldn't have one. It made me even more desperate. In one regression I did with Dr. Brian Weiss's CD, I went back to an ancient time. In a bare, remote countryside, I was on my way home after a long war. I was a warrior with a huge body, like Hagrid in the Harry Potter books. I was dirty, hairy, tough, and strong, and I carried a large hammer as a tool for fighting. Walking with strength and speed, as if I were banging the land with each footstep, I was on my way home to see my wife and young son. It seemed that I had been walking for a long time, tired but still strong in every step. I was alone the entire way. There were only stones and some bushes in the surrounding fields. I walked and walked, with nothing and nobody around. When I saw my home, I became extremely excited and walked even faster. I opened the door to find my wife in a wooden hut, sitting next to a baby's crib. In the crib was my young son. I recognized him as my husband in this life. I got a flash. I was so worried about him not being strong enough to stay by himself and protect his mother when I was at war and could not be with them. I woke up in the regression and realized that it was my own problem, not my husband's, if I constantly worried about him not being strong or mature enough. From then on, I stopped feeling anxious about him. I still nag him from time to time, but not in the same manner as before. In another regression I did during the 5-day hypnotherapy training class at Omega in New York, I didn't go back to a previous life, but instead to the very first time in this life that I felt lonely. I was 6 years old and in China. It was a school day, and the weather was turning cold as autumn stepped out and winter stepped in. School had ended, and I stood at the gate waiting for my mom to take me home. I waited and waited, but she didn't turn up. Seeing the students leaving the classroom and being picked up by their parents or the school bus, I became anxious. When all the students had gone and the buses had set off, I was left alone as darkness came with the evening. I stood on the street in front of the gate, which had already been closed. I was so hopeless. This was the first time in my life that I knew how loneliness felt. In the hypnosis, I thought, why don't I try to walk home by myself? It was only 15 minutes or several blocks away from where I was. Maybe I could remember the way. I took a deep breath and started the walk back home. I was so excited. I was a bit scared, but also a bit happy to leave the darkness in the corner of the school gate. As I took my first big step and set off for home, the scene changed, and in the trance I saw myself running through a long movie or film tape. The contents of the film were all of those situations in which I had experienced loneliness in life, and there had been many over my 30 years. I was growing older and older, from a 6-year-old girl to now, as I ran through all those times. I was so happy and lofty. I ran as if I were flying, my shirt flapping in the wind. I came back to where I was, to the room at the Omega training course, and understood that I was not the helpless little girl of 6 years old. I learned that I could do something by myself and for myself, that I have the confidence to make myself free from the darkness. For more than 30 years, I've been working and learning so hard to overcome all the challenges in my life, rather than waiting and relying on others or feeling helpless. After that regression, I have never had that kind of lonely feeling again, and after a few years, I adopted 2 baby girls as my daughters. I realized that I could do something to make myself happy instead of waiting hopelessly for pregnancy. All 4 of us in the family, and the grannies too, are so happy and pleased with the current situation. I think it might be the best time in my life. It certainly is the sweetest. Tong. The regressions allowed Tong to gain a sense of control in her life. She was able to recognize the past life origins of her doubts about her husband's maturity, which permitted her to let go of her fears and anxieties. Not all symptom-inducing traumas are found in prior lifetimes. Tong's feeling of helplessness was rooted in her present-life childhood. As she watched her subconscious display a series of scenes of her loneliness, she became empowered to take control and to be courageous. Adopting the baby girls represented, to some degree, her conscious decision to not be so fearful and passive, but instead to be active, hopeful, and happy. Tong, from China, also demonstrates the universality of past life memories and their powerful healing potential. The experience of prior lifetimes and of the after-death state is remarkably consistent, no matter which culture or religion is involved. People from wildly divergent nationalities and spiritual traditions are able to remember past lives that took place all over the planet. They learn the same life lessons. They are able to heal physically and emotionally, to repair their relationships, as Tong did, and to attain more peace and happiness in their lives. Early life enculturation and conditioning do not influence the content of the past life recall or spiritual experience. We are all students in this great Earth school. Does it really make a difference where our classroom is located? Evelyn was an African-American woman in her 40s. She had a severe phobia of water and of drowning. Although she didn't have any real clue to where this fear came from, it certainly interfered with her life. Her husband had recently bought a boat, which only intensified her fear. It had been his dream to own one, and he did not understand the depth of Evelyn's phobia. Her husband, who was outside my office during the session, was surprised to learn later that Evelyn did not even own a bathing suit. She felt that this would bring her one dreaded step closer to the water. She was also afraid that her fear of drowning was spilling over onto her 3 children, and that it would interfere with their pleasure in the water and in the new boat. Evelyn's anxiety was so severe that she had traveled half the country to see me. Whenever she put her feet in water, she told me, it felt as if hands were pulling her into it. She was very, very afraid of being around water, but even more afraid of not being able to catch her breath. These fears seemed connected, but not necessarily so. I tucked this away in the back of my mind. As I regressed her, Evelyn first went back to childhood memories. She recalled being an infant and hearing a loud noise, which had caused her to cry. As she continued crying, she couldn't breathe, and she was overcome with anxiety and panic. She saw her aunt and uncle with her, and they were terrified. Evelyn, as a baby, felt confused. She knew that her aunt and uncle were alarmed. She could feel their tension, but she didn't understand at that young age what was happening. Evelyn then experienced a past life that had taken place several hundred years ago, in which she was an African boy of 12 or 13 years. The boy, along with others from his village, had been captured by slave traders. His mother in that life was a spiritual leader of the people, probably possessing special powers and certainly healing abilities, but even she couldn't stop the tragedy of these young children being taken from the village. In that same lifetime, Evelyn recalled the boy being held down by 2 white men, a boot on his throat. The man spoke a strange language. He was then baptized or cleaned in a long tub with a mirror nearby. The tub was filled with water, into which the boy was being forced down. As the water came near his face, he gagged, choked, and found himself unable to breathe. It was truly terrifying. This baptism occurred before leaving Africa, which may help to specify which cultures were engaging in that practice, as there were others who did not enforce baptisms until these slaves arrived in the new country. Her next memory was a vivid one of the same boy, around the age of 20 now. He did not know the rules of these strange white people, and he had merely said something not very significant, to a white woman. Rather suddenly he was grabbed, his arms were tied behind his back, and he was placed on a chopping block and decapitated. Evelyn could see the image of his mother's face nearby. The mother had died, apparently, some time before he had. She was talking to him and communicating a feeling of deep peace. This allowed the young man to become calmer. Afterward, he could see his head and torso separated from each other, but his soul, was all right. Evelyn observed clearly the disdain and aloofness on the face of the white men and women who were looking on. They didn't care. "So barbaric," Evelyn said. "How could people do such things?" The boy's consciousness floated up to the clouds. He was feeling free, strong, and peaceful, and he could breathe. His earlier thought, immediately before the beheading, had been, "I'll never be able to breathe again." At the end of the session, after floating above the boy's body, seeing the mother's face, and feeling this peace, Evelyn told me she felt like skipping, and that she felt so much freer, lighter, and happier. Before emerging from the session, Evelyn had another memory from her current life, an earlier childhood memory with her older brother. He was forcing her to go down a water slide, and she remembered her mouth filling with water as she had difficulty breathing. This confirmed even more so that her fear was not just of water, but of not being able to breathe. After our session ended, Evelyn called her mother, who confirmed that when Evelyn was about 6 months old, she had cried so much that she had turned blue. Her mother had panicked, not knowing what to do, and she had run to the aunt's house with Evelyn in her arms. They were able to calm her down, and her breathing returned to normal as her blue color disappeared. We were both soaked in sweat. The energy, intensity, and visual details and emotions were so profound during this regression session. Just a few days after our session, Evelyn was able to walk in a swimming pool, wearing a bathing suit, the first she had owned in many years, with no anxiety at all. She knew that there was nothing to fear. The fear had come from a long time ago. It was not of the present or the future. Evelyn's phobia was virtually cured in only one session. Simply recalling the trauma in her childhood and past life was enough to allow her to let go of her symptoms. Her fear of water diminished, and her breathing was much improved. As we let go of the past's negatives, and as we regard the future with no worries, we will be released from the constrictions of time. We will live fully in the beauty and freedom of the present moment. In her past life as the young boy sold into slavery, Evelyn experienced firsthand the terrible effects of racial prejudice and inequality. Gabriella, the subject of the next case, also had important lessons to learn about the same subject. Embracing equality. When I first met Gabriella, I couldn't help but notice the sparkles. Her jewelry, sequined purse, and shiny, strappy shoes caught my attention, as most doctors that I meet usually don't wear such items. A well-dressed Caucasian woman with flawless fair skin, long blonde hair, and the bluest eyes, she had a bubbly personality. Everything about her was sparkly. She was excited to begin the session. It shone in her eyes. We talked briefly about why Gabriella had come for the past life session. She wanted to understand the test-taking anxiety that had plagued her throughout her entire life. She tended to over-prepare for major tests in college and even for state boards, but when it came time to take the test, the anxiety was always there. The secondary issue was that, as an only child, she had felt that she constantly had to strive to be the best. Although she had the desire to become a doctor, there was the added pressure to excel in her chosen field. Gabriella regressed easily into the past life, but she was startled to land in the body of a 6-year-old African-American child standing in the middle of a cotton field. The tone of her voice became that of a little girl's as she spoke to me. It was not the color of her skin that surprised her. It was the dirty, threadbare rags that were her clothing, and the shoes that were too old and worn to even cover her feet. She was filthy from being in the hot cotton field all day. Her hair was in pigtails, but they were frizzy and in a terrible state of disarray. Gabriella started crying at the condition of the body in which she found herself. She looked up and saw herself standing beside a big lady with coal-black skin, the same color as hers. She smiled, comforted by the sight of her mamma's thick cheeks and peaceful smile. Mamma looked at her daughter, calling her Sugar, and commenting on the heat as she continued to pick the cotton. Gabriella had the sudden recognition that this woman, in her current life, was her paternal grandmother, with whom she shared a close bond. It was the mid-1800s in Jamestown, Virginia. Sugar and her mamma, and others like them, lived in one of the many shacks situated on the backside of the big house where the plantation owner and his family lived. Mamma worked all day in the cotton fields. Sugar didn't know where her daddy was. He had never been around. She did not like living there. "Mamma keeps me safe from the white people who are mean and spit on me. Not all of them are this way. The white men, they think they are better, but they're not. They ignore me and are disrespectful to my mother, but not to Lily's mother or father." Lily Williams was the young daughter of the plantation owners. She had golden blonde hair, blue eyes, and light skin. Her favorite color was blue, so her mother dressed her in blue dresses with matching ribbons in her hair. She and Sugar were the same age. Lily wore pretty, colorful clothes that were not dirty like those of the kids from the shacks. Sugar longed to wear clean, bright-colored clothing, to live in the front house and be accepted like Lily and her parents. Miss Anna, Lily's mother, was kind to Sugar. She let the girls play together down by the river. They swung from the rope swing into the water and sometimes held hands like little girls do. But Sugar was aware that she wasn't allowed to do this when the other white people were around. "We like the same things," Sugar said, crying again. "I'm just dark. Dark skin makes it like I'm not equal. Lily's parents don't make me feel bad. Just don't let others know, they say." As the girls got older, Sugar would watch Lily go to the schoolhouse, dressed in her pretty clothes, with her books in hand. She wanted to go with her, but had to accept that such a thing would never be permitted. The big house was a brick colonial set on a large plot of land. It had the bulky, rich furnishings often seen in the homes of the wealthiest families of that period. Lily lived there with her mother, her father, and the house slaves who took care of the place. Miss Anna was a nice lady, somewhat plain-looking and fragile in health. She always regarded Sugar with kind eyes. A big man, Mr. Don Williams, Lily's father, wore his thick silver hair pulled back into a ponytail. He was wealthy and owned the plantation and the slaves who lived there. Sugar would watch from the screen door as he sat inside at the table and ate. She wasn't allowed in, but would wait there patiently for Lily to come out. Like his wife, Mr. Don was nice to Sugar. He let the children play together and even helped her learn how to read. It wasn't too long before Miss Anna's health failed completely, and she died. Soon after, Mr. Don remarried to a strict, proper Southern woman who didn't believe in the races mixing and didn't allow the girls to play together or read anymore. Gabriella recognized the stepmother as her own current-life mother. Sugar grew up with the knowledge of what it felt like to be ignored, to not be seen, to not exist. It made her angry that people treated her this way just because of the color of her skin, but she knew her place, knew the trouble she'd be in if she expressed it. She wanted to grow up to be somebody, to make a difference, to live in the big house, to be accepted. Being able to read would prove to be invaluable to her. Mr. Don and Lily secretly educated her. She missed Miss Anna, who was so kind. The lessons were kept quiet so that the stepmother wouldn't know of them. Sugar loved learning and reported everything back to Mama, who told her how proud she was that her daughter was smart enough to learn how to read. Sugar was a spirited girl who was learning to stand up for herself, learning to appreciate being seen and heard. As the times changed, she changed with them. She felt the power of being heard when she and many other women and girls participated in a women's march. "What's right is right. What's wrong is wrong," she demanded, no longer afraid to speak her mind. "Women deserve to be heard. They will be heard." Mr. Don granted Sugar her freedom, and her education on the plantation granted her admittance to medical school. She graduated as one of the first black female doctors in the state of Virginia, and went on to open a practice in nearby Washington, D.C. She had a house just like theirs, and the pretty clothes for which she'd always wished. Her doors were open to anyone needing treatment, whether or not they could pay. To her, they were all the same. Equality was as important to her then as it was to my client, Gabriella, who had always fought for this in her practice. Equality, regardless of gender or skin color. Sugar married a farmer who didn't have much education. It didn't matter to her. She liked him. They raised their 3 children together. She lived a long life practicing medicine and fighting for the rights of people until her death at 86 years old. Although she did not feel ready to end that life, her body simply wore out. When Sugar passed into the light, she was greeted by many people, including Mama, who stepped forward to comfort her. Her guide explained to her that she had done what she had been born to do, which was to stand up for fairness and people's rights. She had proved by example that women could be and do what anyone could, regardless of money or race. Her growth had come through living both sides of equality and knowing what it felt like to be discriminated against based on the color of her skin. She hadn't let discrimination stop her, for she had become an educated black woman in a society where many white women didn't even work as doctors. And in her current life as Gabriella, she continues to help people. Her patients sense her courage and feel safe when she listens to them, while others are quick to brush them off because of the color of their skin. This is helping the residual effects of racism go away. Gabriella's guide revealed that it was time now to let go of self-criticism in her current life. Her soul lesson was one of non-judgment, yet there was still the feeling of being judged and of always having to prove herself. This was creating the added anxiety around test-taking. It was the same way Sugar had felt judged when sitting in a classroom for the first time in medical school. The guide gave Gabriella a quick glimpse at another life in which she was wealthy and lived in an Irish castle. Many people of different races lived there. She had pale white skin and wore beautiful things, and she treated people as equals in her kingdom. It was important to her that the workers in her kingdom know they were not second-class citizens, that everyone was the same regardless of their skin color. This woman was adamant about fairness and equality. Gabriella was shown the contrast to know that all of her past lives, although working through the theme of freedom and equality, did not have the same hardships that she had faced as Sugar. Her soul has lived both extremes, and she could now find balance with non-judgment. Following the session, Gabriella was ecstatic. She talked about the strong connection she has had to cotton plantations, which went beyond a passing interest. As a young girl living in the South in this current lifetime, her heart would cry out for the people on the plantations in the country near her home. But this time she was born into a family of means who were able to give her a first-class education, nice clothes, and all the material comforts she didn't have in the life as Sugar. Gabriella loved beautiful clothing and jewelry, but never judged those who couldn't afford them. Even as a child and in college, and certainly as a doctor, she had stood up for equality when she saw minorities being left out or treated unfairly. Gabriella and her family, who were all part of the life as Sugar, have a special affinity for Williamsburg, Virginia, visiting regularly and even, in the case of Gabriella and her husband, as well as her parents, becoming engaged there. Interestingly, her grandmother in this life, who was her mother in the life on the plantation, has always called her by the nickname Sugar. Gabriella's anxiety about taking tests is different now because she knows that she's prepared and that the anxiety isn't coming from not knowing the material. It's coming from her lifetime as Sugar, when she had once before sat in a room of peers and been judged by the color of her skin. Knowing this has allowed her to punctuate the anxiety so that she can put peace around it, tremendously lessening the impact it once had in the past. Bryn Blankenship. We are all the same. We have been all races, all religions, all colors, both sexes, and many nationalities, because we have to learn from all sides. Leaving our bodies behind when we die means that we leave behind their skin colors, their genders, and their identifying features. We are souls, and souls do not possess such outer and transient characteristics. If everyone were to grasp this concept, racism would instantly disappear. No soul is greater than another. Unfortunately, even innocent children are not exempt from discrimination and prejudice. As a young girl, Sugar was prevented from attending school and playing with her friend. Donna, the author of the following story, remembered a past life as a child in the concentration camps. How many lifetimes will it take to learn the lessons of love? Childhood Connections. During a regression on your 2011 cruise, you led us back to a childhood memory. As you were telling us what you were going to do, I thought that I would go to a memory of when one of my little sisters was brought home from the hospital. However, I did not go there. Where I actually went was to a time when I was 4 years old, when Deborah, another sister of mine, and I got our tonsils out. We were in the hospital and were put to sleep with gas. After a few days of eating ice cream and Jell-O, we were released. In order to leave, we needed to be wheeled out in a wheelchair. I cried and would not get in the wheelchair. My mother tried to get me in it by telling me I would be spanked when we got home. Sure enough, I was spanked. You told us to move on to the lifetime that may help with the childhood memory. I felt gray. Everything was gray. I couldn't see a thing. I felt enclosed and far away from anything. I was 8 years old. We were asked to look at our feet and see what kind of shoes we had on. I had none. I was barefoot. I was being pushed in a wheelchair to my death in a gas chamber. When you asked us to see if there was anyone we recognized from this life, I didn't see any eyes, just the back of heads, and I cried. I was a very active kid, so I always wondered why the wheelchair in my childhood scared me so much. Thank you for helping me to know what had happened. I enjoyed your seminars, and in each session I was able to regress. It has changed me. I understand more of my decisions and path. Donna Ofterdinger. We have all carried over fears, phobias, talents, affinities, and relationships from our past lives. In Donna's case, no rational reason existed for her panic attack and her reaction to the wheelchair when she was 4 years old. She had always wondered why she was so frightened. Her reaction did not fit. Once the past life link to her gas chamber wheelchair was understood, her behavior made sense. The phobia was extinguished, and it will never return. Gail, who shared a somewhat similar past life as Donna, had severe symptoms of insomnia that completely resisted any kind of treatment. Once regressed, she found herself as a child in the concentration camps. Before being taken there, the Nazis, equipped with machine guns, had burst into her house while she was asleep. She awoke panicked and frightened, only to witness the Nazis shoot her parents. She had been killed at the children's camp as a young teenager. Gail had been serving her captors and biting her tongue because she had to, but when she went to her death, she did so with dignity, showing no fear. Shortly after remembering this traumatic lifetime, Gail's sleep difficulty disappeared, and it has not returned. Her insomnia was resolved because she knew that the sudden and terrifying awakening by the German soldiers was from her past life, not her present one. The initial or root cause of her issue was brought to consciousness. The past life wound was healed. Gail can now speak her mind, her truth, without having to bite her tongue or hold back for fear of severe consequences. This also is of the past. Now she is free. The author of the following story had to learn these lessons about holding back and standing up to those in power. She, too, once enslaved, is now free. Overcoming enslavement. How could that be me? I asked myself. The woman that I was studying was someone whom I would never recognize as myself. Her body was deathly thin and wrinkled. She wore a burlap-type tunic that was held on her wraith-like frame with a rope at the waist. She looked 80 years old, but was probably only in her 40s. In contrast to her abject poverty, she wore a valuable gold ring with a deep blue moon-shaped stone, about the size of a nickel. I had started this life as a young, beautiful, strawberry-blonde girl. Only the harshest of lives and isolation could have caused this much change in one lifetime. She loved to ride horses through the countryside and gardens. Because her mother was deceased and her father was unavailable to her, she rode freely, too freely. She was ignorant of the bands of men who roamed purposefully to conquer. The town dictator, a young man himself, had her kidnapped. Her horse was brutally killed. Her world changed permanently overnight. David was the kidnapper, a man of influence in her town. After impregnating her, he had a wedding ceremony performed by the local clergy. Other men gathered around the couple to witness and guard them from onlookers who might interfere. The baby was taken from her at birth. The woman was imprisoned until she became too unhealthy and undesirable to entice companionship, at which point she was threatened and beaten. Her life of enslavement to David was symbolized by her blue stone ring, which everyone who was connected to him was required to wear. She became his delivery woman. She transported valuable items, but she had become such an outcast in the community that no one would interfere with her deliveries. She might as well have been a leper. The townspeople always made a point to ridicule and mock her poverty and enslavement. She was glad to be left alone in her hut on the outskirts of David's property. It ensured a respite from the societal degradation and, worst of all, the constant threats of physical injury. Although her hut barely protected her fire pit from the extinguishing cold winds and mist, the fire was a greatly appreciated luxury to her starving body. The most difficult of her tasks was going to retrieve from David the items she was to deliver. She had to pass by animal pens that housed small creatures who were used for torture. She saw them suffering from beatings and painful amputations. Worst of all was seeing the suffering, but no longer having the feelings of empathy that would motivate her to release them. Her own suffering had dehumanized her to a state of dull existence. Upon entry into the dictator's chambers, she showed her blue stone ring. She kneeled, expecting ridicule and abuse. It was common and inescapable. None of the abuse and horror affected her anymore. Her life was truly that of a victim. There were no choices or escapes unless she was to fight back, which would lead to death. In the last moments of her life, I saw her squatting in front of a fire in her hut, the first one in many days. I could see and feel that her kidneys and other organs had begun to shut down due to starvation. She fell over next to the fire, and her heart stopped beating. It was a pathetic, unrewarding, invisible way to die. As I left that body, I could see the mental enslavement that this body had contained. I had believed that it was better to do the work of evil than to fight back. I learned that fighting back and dying would have been better than living enslaved. Furthermore, complying with the dictator had caused him to become more entrenched in his power. I had nothing to lose by fighting back. I was going to die either way. The familiar characters from that life and my present one were my mother, who died when I was 19 and entering the adult world, and my father, who was emotionally unavailable and detached throughout most of my childhood. The dictator was my second husband, who was emotionally and physically abusive for the 6 months that my daughter and I lived with him. The lessons I learned in that lifetime were that it was okay to be young and beautiful. Young people need support, guidance, and possibly protection as they face the adult world. I learned that it was better to fight back than to live in enslavement. Compliance is a slow death. The things I brought to this lifetime are a deep love and empathy for animals and for those marginalized by society. I spent 25 years of my life working as an advocate for abused and disabled children. I brought a deep bond and protection for my daughter, my one and only child. I appreciate the choice to leave enslaving situations, and I exercise compassion for all, knowing that we are all shaped by our experiences, both past and present. Alice. The debts accruing from Alice's past life will be an obligation to David and his cohorts. To abuse, torture, and humiliate, or kill animals and humans creates karma that must be resolved. They will have to make it up to Alice and the others. Our lessons are of compassion and kindness, not hatred and violence. We are, in reality, spiritual beings. It is never too late to reorient yourself to your spiritual or destined path and to learn these lessons afresh. Wherever you are now is simply a point in time, and the future is multifaceted, changing and growing as you do. No matter how we may have acted in the past, every moment presents another opportunity to treat one another with care and consideration. Even David, at the height of his tyrannical reign, could have decided to become a kinder person, to open his heart, to increase his understanding, to choose love. These are all things that we know so well, yet don't always put into practice. A person who acts out of ego or strictly from intellect can wander very far from his path, but a person who acts from the heart cannot, for the heart will always pull him back. Listen to your intuition, for that is the open heart at work. Choose the loving path. It will never lead you astray. The most difficult lifetimes often provide the opportunity for accelerated and spiritual growth. Such lifetimes do not automatically imply negative karma from the past. Perhaps you chose the difficult life so that you could progress the most. Alice's existence as the delivery woman was very hard and heavy, but she learned invaluable wisdom, and, in her present incarnation, she is manifesting great empathy, compassion, and loving service. The most beautiful flowers often arise from seeds hidden and nurtured by the cold, wet mud. During a recent 5-day workshop, an attendee named Stacy told me that her breathing was becoming more labored, even though she had not yet experienced any past life or childhood memories. She thought that pollens or other antigens might have been in the air, for grass, flowers, and trees were blooming in the early summer warmth of the New York Hudson Valley, where the intensive workshop was taking place. She also told me that she had a history of asthma. I suspected that other factors might have been at work, and so I chose to regress her in front of the group. I picked a volunteer to hold a microphone close to Stacy's mouth so that the group could hear any words that she spoke during the regression. Another group member, a surgeon from Alabama, was hunched forward in his seat as I began the hypnotic process. At the time, I did not know that my randomly chosen microphone holder, sitting right next to Stacy, was a speech therapist and an expert in respiratory conditions. Stacy's first memory was of choking on a slice of apple when she was a young girl. She had panicked at the time, but her mother's response was to give her bread balls to help ease the apple down to her stomach. This failed to help and perhaps exacerbated the situation. The little girl couldn't breathe, and she became even more terrified. Finally, her mother held her upside down by the ankles and firmly whacked her on the back, dislodging the apple slice. I asked Stacy how she had felt just before the apple popped out from her throat. "Frightened to death," she responded. This phrase became the bridge that I used to uncover her past life. "When were you frightened to death before?" I asked. Her answer quickly followed. She had been an 11-year-old boy who had fallen from a rowboat into a lake. The currents carried the boat away from him, and they carried him farther and farther from the shore. He finally became too fatigued to swim any longer. Nobody was around to hear his cries for help. He drowned, gasping and swallowing the lake's water. Stacy's breathing was raspy and rapid, but when the boy's consciousness floated above his body and above the lake and the clouds, it completely changed. She could inhale so freely and deeply now, with no difficulty at all. As I awakened her, her breathing remained relaxed, and it continued to be so even as the audience asked her questions about her experiences as the choking girl and the drowning boy. She had a strong feeling that her respiratory problems would not resurface. The microphone-holding speech therapist had also noticed the remarkable changes. Clavicular breathing, she had observed, had become diaphragmatic. The surgeon agreed. Past life outcomes shed light on present-day phobias and conditions. Once those are remembered, similar situations will never frighten you to death anymore. Renata's story provides more support of this concept. From fear to fulfillment. I had memories of a previous life from a very early age, and I realized instinctively that it was not wise to discuss such experiences with anyone. I was born in Italy in 1952, and I lived in a seaside town. My mother used to take me to a beach that was reached by passing through a strange concrete construction. We had to go up some narrow stairs, walk along an elevated large sort of corridor, and go down the other side onto the beach. The sides of this corridor had a parapet, above which was some barbed wire, to prevent people from reaching more industrial constructions at a much lower level. I can't give a precise description of this place, because I was too young. It was a sort of electric plant. Many years later, I asked my mother when it was demolished, and she told me that it was in 1954, which means I was only 2 years old when I saw it. Every time we passed there, I felt in a strange state. I was very uneasy, yet at the same time I was somehow eager to go, as the feeling was so intense and mesmerizing. The heat was great in summer because the sun fell directly on the concrete. When I passed there, I had a kind of film playing in my mind, images of a woman and a man running in the direction of the beach, she in front, the man behind at a short distance. She was dressed in dark colors and had long curled hair. I knew they were running toward the seashore, escaping something, and that they were in serious danger. Somehow, and I can't explain how a girl less than 2 years old could know this, I was that woman, and the place was North Africa. I also had recurring dreams, or rather nightmares. One was of a gray sea and a wave that suddenly rose and submerged me. Sometimes I was on the beach, sometimes I was near the concrete pier, but the feeling was always of total panic, and I would wake up. The nightmares were still recurring when I was a teenager, and little by little more details appeared. The landscape of a bleak beach, men in dark uniforms chasing us with guns, both me and my companion entering the water. I swam under to find protection from the bullets, but the waves became higher and pressed my head against the bottom of the pier until no space was left for me to breathe, and I drowned. I had a curious problem with my clothes. My mother sewed many of my clothes, not only because she had studied dressmaking, but also because I needed long zippers that no ready-made dresses had. If I wore a sweater, she had to help me by passing it over my head, keeping the collar far away from my face. Once we went to a dressmaker, and my mother forgot to tell her of my problem. When the lady passed the dress over my head, I panicked and started crying and moving my arms frantically, unable to breathe. I used to go to the seaside in summer, and although I had learned to swim, I was always wary when lying on the sand, because I had the illogical fear that a wave might suddenly come up and submerge me. For this reason, I never lay with my back to the sea. On one occasion, when I was approximately 18, I was lying closer to the sea than I normally did, and a much longer wave reached the towel of a friend. She laughed. I was frozen with terror. At 19, I enrolled at the university. One day during the lunch break, I was in the large faculty library. It was November, and the weather was unusually mild, so the windows were open. The tables were very large, with a dark surface covered by a sheet of glass that reflected the images. Suddenly, while my mind was elsewhere and I was lulled by the gentle noise of the fans in the background, looking at my notes and books on the table, I glimpsed the reflection of my face. But it was not my face anymore, at least not the one I knew. It was me, but I was someone else. There was, again, this young woman in her late 20s or early 30s, with long, curled hair and dark eyes. The room was different, much smaller and with a large fan turning. There was a friendly French police officer speaking to me. He told me that we had to run away because the Gestapo had discovered our names. Then I had a more detailed flashback of the beach, our fear, and our death. This experience was strong and took me totally by surprise. One early September after that, I went to visit a friend at the seaside. For some reason, I didn't take my clothes off on that occasion, and we started to walk along the waterline of the beach, chatting and laughing. The sea is shallow in that part of Italy, and the long beach is divided from time to time by tiny constructions of rocks, like mini piers. I was walking there, joking with my friend. I had just come back from some congresses where I had presented 2 papers, and I was telling her how happy I was that they had been received so well. I felt light and enthusiastic. Suddenly we reached one of these rocky constructions that, to be passed, required that we walk into the sea with the water reaching our ankles or shins. When I reached the farthest point of this construction, my body stopped working. I had no control over it, and my mind was filled with silent panic. I couldn't proceed. I was stuck and unable to speak. Later on, my friend told me that I was as white as a ghost. She came to me and took me slowly back to a rock nearby, where I sat down for a while. The first words I could say were, "So it's all true." Obviously, she didn't understand, and I had to explain. For a few years, I had tried to cut off the idea of reincarnation and pretend that all that had happened to me in the past didn't have any specific meaning and was nothing. That experience hit me. I think that what triggered it was the fact that I was fully dressed and not in a swimsuit. The rocks, even if protruding for only a couple of meters into the water, were enough to recall a much bigger and more frightening pier. The experience was so intense and so unexpected, so out of the blue, that I went back to pick up all my old books on reincarnation, bought more, and started reading again. These experiences have formed and directed my entire life in one way or another. I have dedicated my personal and academic research to the themes of reincarnation, symbolism, and the journeys to the other world. My Ph.D. itself was based on the study of a medieval journey to the other world, and I started to read books about hypnotic regressions and tried techniques with some like-minded friends. I qualified as a hypnotherapist and studied more advanced techniques that can be applied in past life regressions, and for a few years now I have run a private practice of hypnotherapy in London. Although I deal with all sorts of problems that hypnotherapy can help to solve, I am happy to say that past life regressions are among the most common techniques I use with my clients. Renata Bartoli. Renata's memories, which were so powerful and persistent, pushed her to dedicate her work and her life to helping others using past life regressions. She knew that her experiences were real. She vividly felt the fear and paralysis that past life traumas could cause in the present, and she is helping many people to overcome and release similar symptoms. Of course, not all regressions are the result of using hypnotic techniques. Renata experienced flashbacks and glimpses when she was near or in the water, through recurring dreams, and even in the faculty library, where she observed her face from her prior lifetime. Her subconscious mind was giving her the information and tools to heal her in the present and, additionally, to steer her toward her soul's work. Renata had the wisdom and the courage to respond to her mind's urgings. I, too, had to overcome old belief systems, skepticism, and left-brain conditioning to dedicate my work and my life to help people in the very same way as Renata. I've been so fortunate and so blessed to find this path. Judith, in the final story of this chapter, was also a self-described left-brained and skeptical person. Even with her doubts, she remained accepting and curious, and she was able to have a wonderfully healing and intuitive experience at a workshop. This incident helped her achieve not only the elimination of a physical symptom that had long troubled her, but also a greater emotional understanding that has forever changed her life. There is no need to judge. I consider myself to be primarily a left-brained and skeptical person. I've been trained as a scientist and veterinarian and had been in practice for over 11 years when I attended my first Weiss seminar. A friend of mine and I had read Many Lives, Many Masters, and we were so excited that he was coming to Fort Lauderdale that we got our tickets 9 months in advance and counted down the days. We were both impressed that a well-respected and well-trained doctor had made such an incredible discovery, and we knew that he had faced ridicule and scorn from his fellow scientists and physicians by coming forward with this mystical technique to rapidly solve unexplained pains, complicated phobias, and hang-ups. I had ordered Dr. Weiss's CDs soon after reading several of his books. While listening to Through Time into Healing one night, I had a completely unexpected and vivid vision of a woman looking into a gilt-framed mirror. Her face was long and thin, white and European in appearance, and I had the impression of late 1700s-style clothing and headdress. Her curly reddish-brown hair framed her face. In the next flash of vision, my hand was trailing along a curved wall, like a tower, and I just knew that I was in a formal garden. I came out of the trance completely amazed that I, who didn't even remember my dreams, could have had such an experience. The day of Brian Weiss's seminar finally arrived, and my friend and her husband met me early at the convention center. We were excited to see Dr. Weiss in person, and we had great seats in the second row. We were amused by the number of people who had brought blankets, pillows, and yoga mats. Turns out they were the smart ones. During the first morning regression, an incredible thing happened. At first, I saw nothing significant during the lifetime. When asked about the death scene, I felt the blade of the guillotine and observed a head rolling into a hateful crowd. The head came to a stop, and I experienced in first person, as if I were the head, a 30-something dark-haired woman leaning over the head, jeering and yelling insults at it. Quite separate from my thoughts, as I was engaged in the scene, I heard a message. You know what it's like to be judged. I awoke out of the trance, and the chronic neck pain that I had suffered for over 4 long years was instantly gone. Afraid to believe it, I kept rolling my neck and bending it every way. No more pain. After the break, we chose a person we did not know personally and exchanged personal items. I chose a woman in a seat close to me. She held my cell phone. I held her ring. During this exercise, Dr. Weiss instructed us not to filter the images that we might receive. My only distinct vision was that of the triangular window of a small speedboat, the type that is on the side of the windshield. I had a bare impression of a lake with mountains and forest in the background. We came out of the trance, and I told her what I had experienced. She listened and said that it really didn't apply to her, but her aunt, who was visiting from up north and who was about 4 seats away from us, lived on a lake surrounded by mountains and forests, and she had a small speedboat. My partner then told me that almost the instant she was into the trance, she had an almost overpowering scent of facial soap, not unpleasant, but very strong. She said that she kept seeing this white bird soaring around. Her aunt overheard her and said that she had had the exact same experience, an overwhelming scent of soap, so strong that she was sniffing the people around her during the exercise, trying to figure out where it came from. She, too, kept seeing a white bird floating and soaring around, and she heard the message, There is no need to judge. Excited about these incredible things that had never happened to a studious and often unimaginative person like myself, I took the opportunity to stand up and address the people in the audience as I told them about this experience. I also told them what it meant, which I will reveal in a minute. After I sat down, the two women in front of us turned around and said that they had both smelled the powerful scent of soap, and that they kept hearing the message, "Let go, let go." The smell that I had always associated with my paternal grandmother, who had died several years previously, was her Dove facial soap. A week before the seminar, I had been thinking a lot about my life and the things I wanted to change. One of my many flaws is judging others too harshly, without considering facts and on very limited information. I suspect it's rooted in my loving but judgmental Midwestern family, which would teach us children about life around the dinner table by speaking of the kids in other families who had turned to drugs or had gotten pregnant. They would always say, "We're so glad you would never do anything like that. We've got great kids." Of course, they meant to teach about staying away from drugs and premarital sex, but it had the unintended consequence of making us more judgmental, because there was little discussion of compassion for the actual person who turned to drugs or of the circumstances that may have led them down that path. I had also been thinking of my beautiful and loving paternal grandmother, Sally, who was alone in the last years of her life after caring for my grandfather, who eventually died of Alzheimer's disease. She lived alone in a big house and did not get many visitors. I would come once a year to do genealogy research in the tiny town of Mount Olive, Illinois, which had been founded by my father's family, and which had a rich history in old newspaper clippings. Each morning I would rush out of the house to get in as much research as possible before the library closed. I remembered quite clearly an incident in which my grandmother, shy and sad, had said to me, "Of course you wouldn't want to spend the morning with an old lady like me." I had hugged her and told her that it was my last day there, that the library would be open, so I had to go, but that I would see her that night. I have always regretted that choice. I could have learned just as much about our family history by listening to my grandma, and I worried that she thought I didn't love her. I know that Grandma used this seminar to tell me to let it go, and that someone was giving me a very good lesson about judging others. My life has changed dramatically since the seminar. I have a terrific story to relate to others, but more important, it stimulates interest in a subject of which most people are not even aware. Past life therapy changed the way I think about others, made me a more loving person, stopped my terrible neck pain, and gave me the tools to help and teach others that the most important lesson that we can learn on this earth is how to love each other unconditionally. Judith Oliver. Judging others and judging ourselves are negative and even harmful actions, often leading to great pain and discomfort. Judith eventually learned the ultimate lesson, that of unconditional love. We keep incarnating to learn this great truth in all its manifestations. We see so much in Judith's story. A person can be scientifically trained, logical, and skeptical, and still have rich, life-transforming experiences. Just keep an open mind to the possibilities. Consciousness does not end with the death of the physical body. Judith was not in her severed head in the guillotine scene. Her consciousness was hovering above and around it, observing the people near her and the actions of the dark-haired woman. She received spiritual instruction even as she experienced the mob and its hatred. The lesson about judging others and allowing yourself to be judged transcended lifetimes. As a bonus, remembering the guillotine trauma instantly healed Judith's chronic neck pain in her present life. Throughout time, we will meet with our loved ones again and again, either on the other side or back here in the physical state. Judith's grandmother seemed to be present, her soapy scent perceived by many people at the workshop, reminding Judith of her love and of the lesson to let go of judgment and of guilt. In the end, only love is real.